Namaskaram. Today I'm going to be talking about the 9th paragraph of Nāṉ Ār. This is a continuation of the 8th paragraph, which I talked about last time. So in order to get the continuity, I will talk a little bit about the 8th paragraph. That is, what are the main points in the 8th paragraph. Then that will provide the context for what Bhagavan says in the 9th paragraph. That is the main point of the 8th and 9th paragraph is clear from what Bhagavan says in the first sentence of the 8th paragraph. What he says there is, for the mind to cease or subside or disappear, implying for it to cease permanently, except vichara, that self-investigation, there are no other adequate means. So this is the main point Bhagavan is making in these 2 paragraphs, but he then goes on to explain, in this context, he goes on to discuss other practices. So after saying this in the first sentence of the 8th paragraph, he then says, if the mind is made to cease by any other means, remaining as if it had ceased, it will again rise up. So, in other words, any cessation of mind we bring about by any means other than self-investigation is only a temporary cessation, because sooner or later the mind will, though the mind will remain subsided for a while, it will rise up again. Just like in sleep, the mind subsides, but it again rises up. And then in the 3rd sentence, he says, even by pranayama, the mind will cease, implying it will subside temporarily, as it does in sleep. By pranayama, we can bring about a calming of the mind. And if we take that calming to if we go far enough in that practice, we can actually bring about manalaya, a state like sleep, which is called nirvikalpa samadhi, by the practice of pranayama. But then in the next sentence, he says, however, so long as the prana remains subsided, the mind will also remain subsided. And when the prana emerges, meaning the mind, will also emerge and wander under the sway of its vasanas. What Bhagavan is implying here is that by bringing about the cessation of mind by means of pranayama, we are not bringing about the destruction of vasanas. So as soon as the mind, or even the weakening of vasanas, so as soon as the mind rises again, it will again begin to wander under the sway of its vasanas. And then Bhagavan explains this in more detail in the in several sentences following that. And then he concludes this paragraph by saying, therefore, pranayama is just an aid to restrain the mind, implying that it's an aid to make the mind cease temporarily, but it will not bring about manonasa. Manonasa means the annihilation of the mind, the permanent cessation of the mind. That is the main point Bhagavan is making in this 8th paragraph. But though it can help to subdue the mind, it cannot bring about its destruction. And then in the 9th paragraph begins where that left off. So what he says in the 9th paragraph, in the first sentence, he says, pranayāmam pōla-v-ē. That is just like pranayama, mūrtti-dhyāṇam, mantra-japam, āhāra-niyamam, eṇbavaigaḻum, maṉattai, aḍakkum, sahāyaṅgaḻ-ē. That is just like pranayama, what are called mūrti-dhyāna, mantra-japa, and āhāra-niyama are also only aids that restrain the mind. The implication is that just like pranayama is an aid to restrain the mind but will not bring about its annihilation, the implication is here that though these are aids to bring about the subjugation of mind, they will not bring about its annihilation. That is not specified here, but it's clear from, because this comes immediately after that sentence in which he said that pranayama is only an aid but will not bring about manonasa. Here he says these other practices are only aids, implying they will not bring about manonasa. So the practices he refers to here are mūrti-dhyāna. Mūrti means a form, particularly in this context, a form of God. So mūrti-dhyāna means meditation on a form of God. Mantra-japa means repetition of a mantra. And āhāra-niyama means restriction of what is taken in, implying restriction on diet, on what we eat. These are all only aids that restrain the mind. So these can be aids, but they cannot bring about the destruction of the mind. That is the implication in this first sentence. Then he goes on to explain this. First, he explains about mūrti-dhyāna mantra-japa, and at the end, he'll explain also about āhāra-niyama. So what he says about mūrti-dhyāna and mantra-japa is, both in the second sentence, mūrti-dhyāna tālam, mantra-japa tālam, manam ekagrate adekiridu. That means both by mūrti-dhyāna and by mantra-japa, the mind gains ekagrata. Ekagrata means one-pointedness. And then in the third sentence, he gives an analogy to explain this. This sentence is in two parts. First, he gives an analogy, and then he gives what we have to, what it's analogous to. So the analogy he gives in the first half of the sentence is sada chalitu kondirikum yanain tuti kayel oru sangliye kodatal avyane epidi ve ondreum patramal adeye patri kondu salamo. What that means is, just as if one gives a chain in the trunk of an elephant, which is always moving, that elephant will proceed grasping it, grasping the chain, without grasping anything else. That is, if an elephant is walking through a town or village, it'll be passing so many shops and street vendors and others. The inclination of the elephant is it will be swinging its trunk here and there. If it sees an apple, let's say some fruit, some mango or something, here he'll pick up the mango and eat it, and he'll be constantly picking up things. That's the nature of the elephant. Its trunk is always moving about, trying to grasp one thing or another. So when Mahout, the elephant, the people who drive the elephants, when they take an elephant through a busy village or town street, they will give the elephant a chain to hold. By holding that chain, the elephant won't try and hold anything else. So that is the analogy. Likewise, that is in exactly the same way, the mind, then he goes on, apadiye, that means in that way, in the same way, sada chalitu kondirikum manamum, the mind which is always moving, adane edo oru namum aladu rupatil parakinal, adeye patri kondirikum. So in exactly the same way, or likewise, the mind, which is always moving, will, if one makes it habituated to holding any one name or form, it will remain grasping that name or form alone, implying that it won't be thinking of other things. So just like the elephant, if it's given a chain to hold in its trunk, will not try to grasp other things. The mind, if it is habituated by practice, if one practices making the mind hold on to any one name or form, it will remain grasping that, and won't be trying to grasp other things. In other words, it won't be thinking unnecessary thoughts about anything else. And then he goes on to say, Manam alavirenda ninevugalai virikindra patiyal, because of the way in which the mind spreads out as innumerable thoughts, Obvaru ninevum adi balavina maha pokiridu. Each thought becomes extremely weak. That is, normally we are thinking so many thoughts about so many things. In other words, our mind is scattered, going here, there, and thinking about this, thinking about that. All those thoughts become weak because there's no focus in the mind. When it's scattered here and there, the thoughts become weak. And then he goes on to say, when thoughts reduce and reduce, ninevugul adanga adanga, agagra tanmei adendu, adanal balate adekira adenda manatiku, Atma-vichara, Atma-vicharam sulapamai siddhikum. That means when thoughts reduce and reduce, for the mind which gaining ekagratanmai, that means one-pointed nature, has thereby, the mind which has thereby gained strength by gaining that ekagratanmai, for such a mind, Atma-vichara will be easily accomplished. In other words, if the mind is trained to hold on to one thing, one name or form, if we then turn such a one-pointed mind to the practice of self-investigation, because it's not branching out into many thoughts, because it's gained strength by focusing on one thing rather than scattering over onto many things. For such a mind, such a focused mind, it will be easy to it will be relatively easy to achieve success in investigating ourselves. And then in the final sentence, he says, he now then talks about āhāra-niyama, the restriction of diet. What he says in the last final sentence is, āhāra-niyama surrender, mika surrender. That is, āhāra-niyama surrender, mita sattvika āhāra-niyamatal, manatin sattva-gunam vritti-ahi, Atma-vicharitkū sahāyaṅgaḻ undākiridu. That means by mita sattvika āhāra-niyama. Mita means moderate, implying moderate quantities. Sattvika means what is conducive to sattva. Sattva is the state of calmness, peace, and clarity. Literally, sattva means beingness. So the certain types of food will be more conducive to a sattvic state of mind than other foods. So mita sattvika āhāra-niyama. Āhāra means food. Literally, āhāra means what is taken in. In this context, it means food, but it can also imply what is taken in through the five senses. So if we're always, for example, if you're always watching violent movies or something, that's not going to produce a sattvic state of mind. So what we take in through both, that is it. Primarily, Bhagavan is here talking about food, but we can extend the meaning of this, the implication of this, that āhāra means not only the food, physical food that we take in the body, but the sense perceptions that we take in through the perceptions that we take in through the five senses also have an effect on the mind. But that's a secondary meaning, as I say. So mita sattvika āhāra-niyama, niyama means a restriction. So mita sattvika āhāra-niyama means the restriction of consuming only such food that is conducive to a sattvic state of mind, and consuming that food in moderate quantities. That is, even sattvic food, if we overeat, is going to lead to dullness. So we should eat in moderate quantities and in food that is conducive to producing a sattvic state of mind. Particularly, sattvic food is most important thing. We should avoid intoxicants, alcohol and other drugs and things, and tobacco and all such things that are intoxicants. We should also avoid foods that have a tamasic or rajasic effect on the mind. Tamasic means it makes the mind dull. Rajasic means it makes the mind restless. So those foods that make the mind either restless or dull are not conducive to any form of spiritual practice, particularly not the practice of self-investigation. Whereas foods that produce that are more conducive to a sattvic state of mind are suitable. Those sattvic, generally sattvic food means vegetarian or vegan food. There are two reasons for that. Firstly, if you eat meat firstly, that the meat itself, that is physically meat, is more difficult to digest. It has a more tamasic and rajasic effect on the mind. But most important of all, if one is eating meat or any food that is produced on the basis of himsa means causing harm, that will have an impact on the mind. So we need to eat those foods that have been produced with the minimum amount of harm. So generally speaking, in old days in India, milk was considered a sattvic food. But nowadays, with the modern dairy industry, involves a huge amount of cruelty. The calves being separated from the mother 1 or 2 days after birth, and male calves being slaughtered, and I mean, the dairy industry and the meat industry are very, very closely interconnected. So modern dairy practices are far from ahimsa. They're the very antithesis of ahimsa. So unless one can get milk from a source that avoids all forms of himsa, which is very difficult to get nowadays, it's better to avoid milk also. Though in old days in India, when one of the ancient practices in India was that the mother cow should first be allowed to give milk to the calf, and after the calf has had enough, any surplus milk can then be milked. That was the custom in old days, but that is no longer the custom nowadays. So times have changed, and so we have to, according to the present time, what's important is the principle underlying it. And one of the most important principles underlying the idea of sattvic ahāra is that it is ahimsa. A food is produced in a way that causes harm to any living beings. That is obviously not sattvic. That will have an adverse effect on our mind. So we should be strictly vegetarian, and in the context of the modern day world, probably it's best to be vegan also, to avoid all animal products. And in India, always, even though in old days in India, milk was considered sattvic, eggs were never considered sattvic. Eggs were always, vegetarians in India never ate eggs. Because they have much the same tamasic and rajasic qualities that meat has. And also eggs have potential life in them. So it is, dubious, consuming eggs is also dubious morally dubious. Some people say nowadays eggs are unfertilized eggs, but producing unfertilized eggs involves cruelty because it's interfering with the natural life cycle of chickens. So generally, we want to avoid causing harm. That's a very important principle for anyone following the spiritual path. Because if we do harm to others, we are doing to others what we wouldn't do to ourselves. So in other words, we are giving more importance to the person we take ourselves to be than to others. Why do we give so much importance to this person we take ourselves to be? Because of ego, because we take, I am this person, so I matter more than others. That is the attitude of a strong ego. As the ego gets purified by following the spiritual path, that distinction between oneself and another begins to dissolve. And when we see others suffering, we suffer to see others suffering because we understand that those others are just like us. They just like we want to live a peaceful life in our body with avoiding injury and harm of all types. We should wish the same for others also. These are all the principles behind these things, but I mean, these all do have an effect on our state of mind. So what Bhagavan says is, by taking such sattvic conducive food in moderate quantity, and he said that is the best, āhāra-niyama surrender, that is the best of all restrictions. So in yoga, there are so many restrictions are prescribed, but Bhagavan says of all the restrictions, all the niyamas, this mita sattvika āhāra-niyama is the best of all. In fact, this is the only niyama that Bhagavan really emphasized. So by this restriction of consuming only sattvic conducive food in moderate quantities, the sattva guna, that the quality of beingness, calmness, and clarity of the mind increases. And the more the mind is sattvic, that is conducive to self-investigation. Why is that? Because when we're investigating ourselves, we are turning our attention inwards to investigate who we ourselves are. We are the subtlest of all things. So if our mind is very dull or very restless, Bhagavan gave an analogy, often gave an analogy of if a mind is in a rajasic state, it is, and you try to investigate yourself, it is like looking for a very small object in the flame of a lamp. Using a lamp which is flickering in the wind. So he's comparing the rajasic, restless mind to a lamp that's flickering in the wind. But such a lamp won't help you to, or it'll be difficult to find a very small object that's maybe dropped in the grass or something if you're searching with a lamp that's flickering in the wind. And for the tamasic mind means a mind that is dull. He said, trying to investigate oneself with a tamasic mind is like trying to separate the fine threads of a silk cloth with a blunt crowbar, blunt iron bar. Obviously, if you want to separate the threads of a silk cloth, you need a very fine, sharp needle. Then you'll be able to separate them. But if you've got a blunt iron rod, it won't be of much use to separate the threads of silk. Likewise, the tamasic mind is not helpful in investigating ourselves. So since we are trying to investigate and see what we ourselves actually are, and since we are the subtlest of all things, we need a very pure and clear mind to do so. So a mind that is endowed with sattva guna is a more suitable instrument for investigating ourselves than a mind that is endowed with Rajaguna or Tamaguna. So he says, well, by taking Metta-sattvika ahara, by following this restriction of taking only Metta-sattvika ahara, the sattva guna of the mind will increase, and that will help us in our practice of self-investigation. So that's the whole paragraph. Coming back to what Bhagavan says about mūrti-dhyāna and mantra-japa. Bhagavan's main aim here, as I said in these two paragraphs, 8 and 9, is the main emphasis is what he says in the first sentence, but to make the mind subside, the only adequate means is self-investigation. So these other practices, Bhagavan makes some allowance for them, but he's not exactly encouraging them. He's saying, yes, if you follow that, it can be a help, but it's not the main thing. So Bhagavan doesn't go into this subject very deeply here. Elsewhere, he discussed this more deeply. So if we consider what he said elsewhere, particularly, for example, in the early verses of Upadesha India, mūrti-dhyāna and mantra-japa, he said, by such practices, the mind gains one-pointedness. But what is important to consider, if our aim is if our aim is the annihilation of ego, we will be doing mūrti-dhyāna and mantra-japa. If we do it, we'll be doing it with the love to surrender ourselves. It's for that love with which we do the mūrti-dhyāna and mantra-japa that really gives the mind the requisite one-pointedness that will help in this path of vichara. Why do I say that? Because many people who do mūrti-dhyāna or mantra-japa, they are not doing it with a desire to surrender themselves. They believe that if they do mūrti-dhyāna or mantra-japa, they may believe that if they meditate on God, on a form of God or a name of God, then God will be pleased with them, and then they'll be able to pass their exams, they'll be able to get a promotion in their job, their family will be taken care of by God, and everything in life will be favorable, and if they've got daughters to marry, they'll be able to find suitable husbands for their daughters, and all these things. That there are so many reasons why people do practices like mūrti-dhyāna, mantra-japa. Often those practices are done with what is called a kamyata motive. That is, they are doing it for the fulfillment of some particular desire. If we're doing these practices for the fulfillment of desire, we are not really making our mind one-pointed. We may make our mind one-pointed for the 15, 20, 30 minutes we are doing our mūrti-dhyāna or mantra-japa, but as soon as we finished, our mind again begins to think about all the things we want to, all our kamyata aims, all the ways to fulfill our desires and the desires we want, what are the desires we want to fulfill. So such a mind is not really a one-pointed mind. The mind will truly become one-pointed, and it will gain the requisite one-pointedness if mūrti-dhyāna and mantra-japa are done, not for gaining any particular, not for the fulfillment of any particular desire, but just for the love of God. That's why Bhagavan says in verse 3 of Upadesha India, kartanukākum nishkarmiya karma. That is, nishkarmiya karma means action that is done without, not motivated by desire. That is not for the fulfillment of some desire, but kartanukākum, but for God. Done for God. Kartanukākum means done for God. That implies done for the love of God. So if our motivation in doing mūrti-dhyāna and mantra-japa is not for fulfillment of any desire, but just for love of God. We're doing it just for the love of God. Such a mind, but by such practices, the mind will gain one-pointedness. And also, as Bhagavan says in verse 3 of Upadeshundya, it will be doing nishkarmaya karma for the love of God will purify the mind and show the way to liberation. Purify the mind means it will reduce the strength of our Vishaya vasanas, because instead of directing our mind towards the fulfillment of our desires, we're directing it towards God with love. That will reduce the strength of our other vasanas, and that purification, the mind will thereby be purified, and our love for God will increase. That will make it easier for us to turn within when we come to understand that God is nothing but that which is shining in our heart as I. So the best way to meditate on God is to meditate only on I. So though Bhagavan doesn't explicitly mention it here, we, from what he's taught us elsewhere, we have to take it to mean he's not talking here about mūrti-dhyāna and mantra-japa merely as a concentration exercise. The implication is that these practices should be done with love. Only if they're done with love does the mind gain the requisite one-pointedness. That is, merely being able to concentrate the mind for a specified period of time on one name or form doesn't mean that it has got the requisite ekagrita. The ekagrita, the one-pointedness, means the mind should, even when we're not specifically doing the mūrti-dhyāna or mantra-japa, our mind should be dwelling on God with love. That is the type of one-pointedness that Bhagavan is talking about here, because only such one-pointedness will reduce the mind spreading out in innumerable thoughts. If we just do it as a concentration exercise, so long as we're concentrated, the mind won't be spreading out as innumerable thoughts. As soon as our concentration exercise, our so-called meditation, is over, we'll at once again start thinking all the worldly thoughts that we were thinking previously. So to understand what Bhagavan says here in the context of his teaching more broadly, we need to understand when he talks about, when he says by mūrti-dhyāna and mantra-japa, the mind will gain one-pointedness, agragrita. He's implying that by doing mūrti-dhyāna and mantra-japa with love, and by doing it with love, the mind is curbed from going towards other things. The mind, and thereby the mind will the spreading out of the mind as innumerable thoughts will reduce, and the mind will. He says in a later sentence, when thoughts reduce and reduce, for the mind which gaining ekagratanmai. Ekagratanmai means one-pointed nature. So it becomes second nature to the mind to be one-pointed, to think only of God. If the mind has so much love for God that it naturally thinks of God rather than concerning itself with worldly matters, for such a mind, that is the requisite strength that is necessary to achieve success in Atma-vichara. So though Bhagavan doesn't specifically mention love or bhakti here, we should understand it as being implied in what he's saying here about mūrti-dhyāna mantra-japa.